Now, I'd like to begin my presentation with the title of The Beginning and Historical Value of National Science Museum. So this is divided into 6 chapters, and they are centered on some monumental periods of the National Science Museum, which I'm going to call NSM from now on. So I'm going to tell you about the changes that NSM has gone through historically. So the reason why I chose this topic for my presentation is because there is a book that is published to commemorate the 30th year of the NSM moving to Daedo, and the title of the publication is The Bridge Where People Meet Science. And when we were publishing this book, one of the things that were heatedly debated within the museum is how are we going to define the origin of the NSM, or the beginning of the NSM? So throughout its history, the NSM has undergone various names and various systems. So for example, when Korea was under Japanese colonization, the Science Museum was established under the name as Unsa Memorial Science Hall, and then after liberation, it was established under the name of the National Museum of Science, and then after it was destroyed, it has become the NSM that you know today back in the 1990s. Then among all these predecessors of the NSM, which one truly marks the beginning of the National Science Museum in Korea? I'd like to discuss that. The focus of my research is not just about the creation of a physical space that is called the Science Museum, but I would like to also consider both historical and social background through which the Science Museum came into life and the changes that it underwent. And I'm going to also briefly explain how the Science Museum should change itself, or what direction it should go to in face of the changes that are occurring today. So first, let me talk about the Unsa Memorial Science Museum. So the Unsa Memorial Science Museum is the first science museum that was ever established on the Korean land. So in 1925, the Japanese Government General of Korea established this museum to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the wedding of the Japanese emperor. So they were given the royal bounty of 170,000 won. So as you can see from its name, Unsa, it basically means that the emperor granted his favor in establishing this museum. And the model of the Unsa Memorial Science Museum was the Tokyo Museum, and a lot of the exhibits were materials that were related to modern lifestyle, but actually the focus of the museum was actually to propagate a lot of the projects that were carried out by the Japanese government during the colonization period. There were a lot of science lectures and movies shown and expos and so on, and even those lectures emphasized the dominance of Japanese, like their eugenic dominance, and they had some elements of cult science in it. For example, they would say that the bulletproof jacket that the Japanese have made have this mysterious power to avoid bullets and so on. So the meaning of the Unsa Memorial Science Museum, of course, it is the first scientific institution that was physically built in Korea, but rather than propagating science ideology, it was a political space that was used to justify Japanese colonization, and its purpose and the process of establishment and the impact that it had on the Koreans and the content and the materials of the Science Museum. When we look all into that, I don't think the Unsa Memorial Science Museum played the essential or the fundamental role of a true science museum. Nevertheless, in official documents that are published by the Korean government, they just say that the Unsa Memorial Science Museum is the origin or the beginning of science museum in Korea. So in 2017, the Korean government published the Science and Technology History of 50 Years. And in those publications, official publications, they say that Unsa Memorial Science Museum is the origin of Science Museum in Korea. So I think we really need to clearly define the role and the meaning of the first science museum here in Korea. Abraham Lincoln said the principle of democracy, of the people, by the people, and for the people. And that should be the purpose of the government. So if we apply that to science museum, the principle of a science museum in Korea should be of the Koreans, for the Koreans, and by the Koreans. And in that sense, Unsa Memorial Science Museum, yes, it is the first physical space that we can call a science museum established on the Korean land, but it was not for the Koreans, it was not by the Koreans. Therefore, regardless of what official papers of the government say, it is difficult for us to say that the Unsa Memorial Science Museum is the origin of Science Museum in Korea. And after Korea was liberated from Japan, the name changed into the National Museum of Science, or the NMS. Famous entomologist Jeonbuk National was the president, and the famous butterfly researcher Seok Ju-myung was the head of zoology research. And a lot of organization inherited the legacy of the Unsa Memorial Science Museum and of the colonization era. And due to political and social confusion that occurred after liberation, there was shortage of budget. So we couldn't really change a lot of things in the museum. And as you can see from its name, it was really a museum that displayed the artifacts related to science and technology. And to resolve this issue, an act was enacted in relation to the organization of a National Science Museum in Korea. So in Article 1 of this act, it said the purpose of the facility should be to disseminate science. And Article 2 say that it will oversee scientific and research investigation and issues related to enhancing the dissemination of science, and the organization will be divided into General Affairs Office, Dissemination Office, and Research Office, and so on. So the Science Museum went under a reorg. So the Unsa Memorial Science Museum and the predecessors had the legacy of the colonialization period in both its hardware and software aspect, but I guess with the act enacted, the software somewhat changed. And like I said before, the official documents of the Korean government see Unsa as the origin of Korea's science museum. And it says that the purpose of Unsa Memorial Science Museum, but a paper says that because the purpose of Unsa Memorial Science Museum was to assimilate Koreans as Japanese, we cannot see that as the origin of Science Museum. But although books and papers say this, the website of the National Science Museum say this museum was established first in 1949. And that in 1949, it was established as a national science museum. So there are some errors or mistakes made even in the official website and other official papers. So even in the paper on the establishment of the National Gwacheon Science Museum, it says that the Unsa Memorial Science Museum is the origin. So a lot of these papers are very confusing as to what the truth is. As explained earlier, this confusion stems from the fact that, it stems from the fact that we are under a transitional period where we are departing from the legacy of the Japanese colonization era. But due to the Korean War, everything about the Science Museum actually destroyed in fire. Only the walls remained. So even the hardware of the Science Museum was destroyed, which means that Korea was able to fully break away from the legacy of the colonization period. And afterwards, after the war ended, the National Science Museum was newly established. So we used the same name, the name of its predecessor, but the building and the operation system were all changed. And in 1967 and 1969, like I said before, the act related to Science Museum was established, and even that act underwent a modification. So previously the purpose was to disseminate science, but now the new purpose, the modified act says its purpose is to research, exhibit, and disseminate basic science and natural science, and to integrate science into our daily life. And whereas it belonged to the Education Ministry before, it belonged to the Ministry of Science and Technology. And since the late 1960s and early 1980s, making science or integrating science into our daily lives was the key role of the NSM, and also a national project as well. The Park Chung-hee government of Korea pursued what it called the second five-year plan for promotion of science and technology, and it sought to popularize science and technology among the Korean people. And three institutions were in charge of this: the Korea Institute for Advanced Technology, the Korea Federation of Science and Technology Societies, and the National Science Museum. The role of the National Science Museum was to make exhibitions about science and technologies and to supplement school education related to science. So it had to engage in a lot of activities. But the problem is a lot of those activities had their limitations. First of all, this was a nationwide movement, but the lectures that were given by the science museums was actually given to students and not to the general public. The lecture for general public was established only in the 1970s, so late 1970s. So the national science movement that was conducted in 1960s and 70s was actually mostly focused on students. And whereas the purpose of a science museum is about holding exhibitions, I guess they kind of performed poorly in terms of giving exhibitions. So we did not actually make a lot of progress from the time when the museum was an Eunsa Memorial Science Museum per se. So in the 1960s, the newly established Science Museum had the significance in that it was of the Koreans, by the Koreans, and for the Koreans. It was the beginning of that principle. However, as I pointed out earlier, its main function, exhibition, for example, was lacking. And in the 1990s, and to overcome that limitation at the late 1970s, they conducted a thorough investigation of the museum and re-established the purpose and the meaning of the museum. And one of that is that the museum would become the symbol of the nation and a growth engine of the nation, and also become a space that displays the culture and history of Korea as a science nation. And that it should serve also as a space where Korea would engage in exchanges with the international community in terms of science and technology. So that led the way to the creation of the National Central Museum of Science, which is the NSM that you know as today. And that's when researches pertaining to Korea's science and technology history began in earnest. And the National Science Museum has moved to Daedeok, Innopolis. And a lot of the facilities or agencies that are in Daedeok, Innopolis did not really connect to the public. But once NSM came into Daedeok, the area became more close to the public, where it would engage in close communication, for example, with the people. So this is an advancement of not only the Science Museum, but also Korea's science industry as well. So if you look at the origin and the history of the Science Museum in Korea, the history of NSM is in line with, or it occurred in parallel with, the advancement of science and technology here in Korea. And it embraces the historic pain of Japanese colonization and Korean War. And it also carried out the mission of its time, for example, reconstruction of the nation and economic development, and so on. And now it faces a new challenge of now leading the world as a powerhouse of science. So when we look at the origin of the Science Museum here in Korea, Unsan Memorial Science Museum, like I said before, had only a meaning in terms of its physical space, but it was destroyed in the Korean War. And I think, so afterwards, after the Korean War, when the National Science Museum was newly created, I think that could be called the true origin of the modern National Science Museum today. And the NSM, like I said before, played a lot of role in the advancement of science and technology in Korea. And when we are undergoing a lot of changes these days, for example, the fourth industrial revolution has arrived, and this requires a lot of people to integrate critical thinking, creativity, communication, and collaboration. So we are now standing at the boundary of another change. So the National Science Museum is now at a juncture where it needs to seek on how it should change and what direction it should go to. So I went over my time, so I'm going to conclude my presentation here. But one concern I do have is that my presentation is my personal view. It does not reflect the official stance of the National Science Museum. I'd like to make that clear. Like I said, it's only been less than a year since I've been working at NSM, so I have not yet become fully integrated into the museum. I guess you can say I'm both an insider and outsider, so I hope that you will also